All right. So pretty straightforward today. We're going to try to look at the causes and consequences of long distance migration in the period 1750 to 1900. But I want to take a minute and point out that we spent the last few days talking about imperialism, and today we're talking about migration. And these ideas, these concepts are grouped together in Unit 6. But Unit 6 is not called imperialism and migration. It's called consequences of industrialization. That's important for us to understand, that this type of migration only exists because of the industrial process. The industrial process led to an extraordinary increase of demands for consumer goods all around the world. And this demand for consumer goods led to a massive increase for raw materials that could be manufactured into such consumer goods. This meant that laborers were needed in order to increase production and therefore increase manufacturing so that there are more consumer goods. That happened because of industrialization. Further, industrialization made it possible because of the fact that the technologies, the transportation-based technologies, made regular long-distance migration of hundreds of thousands of people possible. If they were still traveling by sail through the Indian Ocean and hadn't connected different parts of the world, they wouldn't be able to actually go about the process of long distance migrations in the way that they do during the period 1750 to 1900. So there's lots of different causes and consequences of long distance migration, but it's important to understand it in the, ready? In the context of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is what makes this entire lesson and the two lessons that we've done over the last 2 days possible. Both imperialism and migration only operate in the context of the Industrial Revolution. And the way that the Industrial Revolution strengthened the technology and economies of European and the United States of America and even Japan in order to allow for expansion and the labor needs that led to migration. So let's move into our lesson. I already mentioned that throughout the 1800s, first Britain began to abolish and work to abolish for other countries the Atlantic slave trade. But also throughout the 1800s, most of the Americas, all of the Americas actually ended slavery in their states in general through the process known as abolition. You can see in this picture here on your right, a popular slogan or logo or phrase that was used as a part of the British abolition movement. In the Americas, you can see that throughout the 1800s, every state, even you can still tell what's happening, even though this is a map in French, it's still pretty easy to recognize the name of the states, and also the numbers happen to be the same. So I still put this map, this French map in here, even though I personally don't speak French. But you can look at this and you can see the timeline of American states in the Americas actually eliminating slavery. Of course, the three last states were the United States of America in 1865, Cuba in 1886, and Brazil in 1888. This reality, the end of slavery in these states, led to companies and plantation owners and farm owners to look for a new source of labor. And unsurprisingly, they wanted a new source of labor without having new expenditures, meaning they didn't want to spend a lot of their money on this new source of labor. So with slavery being illegal, they looked for ways to create systems that were similar or just as cheap as slavery. So there are several different types of indentured oh my gosh, there are several different types of labor migration as a result of this need for labor. One of the most commonly recognized type is indentured servitude. When indentured servitude takes place, usually people had from a lot of times from Asia and sometimes from Africa, people had contracts that lasted a certain amount of time, 7 years, maybe 10 years, and they would get free travel to wherever it was that they were going to do the work. Then they would work for nearly free and very little compensation in terms of food and shelter for the term of their contract, and then they were supposed to return home. Although they usually had to pay their own way to get home, which made that a bit of a dubious part of the contract. Oftentimes, indentured servants stayed much longer than they were contracted to stay, and they made homes in the new places, in their new homes, and began to build societies there. Another type of labor migration included imperial recruitment, where Indians, for example, were forced by the British imperial government to leave parts of India and move into other parts. For example, we just read about the sugar colonies in an island off the coast of Southeast Africa. They might be forced to move to that very island in order to work in a sugar plantation there. So imperial recruitment was very similar to indentured servitude, except for you were within one empire, and it was the colonial government moving people from one section to another section. Oh, sorry. One other major type of labor migration included penal colonies. The most famous example of a penal colony is the British colony of Australia, although the French also had penal colonies in Africa. As a part of their settler colony that the British had started in Australia, they often sent prisoners and debtors in order to do large amounts of difficult labor. The penal colony, the practice of sending prisoners to Australia lasted for a while, but ultimately, even despite the labor conditions that many people experienced in Australia, as they chose to stay after their time had been served, it was decided that such a punishment wasn't much of a punishment at all. Here's some important examples of where different people in large numbers moved in these major migration patterns. For example, Indian laborers moved to British colonies in the Caribbean, in both South and East Africa, and in the Pacific Island Ocean of Fiji. In the Pacific Ocean Island. You know what? You can tell I haven't really spoken a lot today, can't you? Okay. Chinese laborers moved to lots of different places. Two of the most commonly recognized places are California in the United States of America, and to the British colony of Malaya in order to work on railroads and farms. And Japanese laborers moved to sugar plantations in Hawaii, Peru, and Cuba. There's lots of different reasons to leave home, but most of the time those reasons were economic and involved the idea that there was more opportunity. As bad as it seemed to have to work on a farm or to be in the indentured servant labor conditions, seemed certainly much better than the conditions where they were. In India, one of the common reasons that people left was extreme poverty under British rule, poverty that led to great famine across India. In China, there were problems such as overpopulation and a need to move population in order to decrease density, and also disorder that was brought about by the Taiping Rebellion. Ireland famously had a massive famine in the 1800s, and as a result, thousands of Irish people left Ireland and moved to primarily the United States. But another factor forced them away from Ireland, which included political dissent against Britain. Britain began to take action against Ireland, including dissolving its parliament in the early 1800s. And so this caused many Irish people to leave Ireland as well. But it's important to note that migration wasn't always about labor. There were other examples of non-labor migrants. For example, British technical engineers moved to different parts of the British Empire and settled in different parts of the British Empire in order to help develop infrastructure and other important engineering needs. As a matter of fact, so many British engineers left Britain into other parts of the British Empire that it was almost like what they call an engineered diaspora, or the idea of the science also that moved along with people and spread along into these different parts of the British Empire. Another common idea of non-labor migrants included British trying to set up a settler colony in Argentina. Though Britain didn't establish a full-blown settler colony in Argentina, and Argentina was only part of the British Empire, but not actually colonized by the British Empire, many bankers and financiers went to be a part of the British settler colony in Argentina. Japan actually attempted to create a settler colony of its own in Mexico. And while they played a major role in the Mexican economy there and Mexican agriculture, they failed to establish a full-blown settler colony. Another example of non-labor migrants is students going to study the culture and study in, and not just study math and science, but also to study the culture and bring back both social, cultural, and political ideas. One of the most famous examples of this is Japanese students who traveled to the United States in order to participate in studies. Okay, I'm going to give you 2 minutes to read this document. And I'm not giving you very much direction with reading this document, but so I just want you to kind of take some notes and think about it, and also think about not just what were the motivating factors, which we already looked at, but I want you to think in this document, who is migrating? So I want you to look over the motivating factors for migration, which is reviewing what we've just discussed. And I also want you to ask yourself the question, who is migrating? I'll give you about 90 seconds or so. Okay, so when you read this article, or when you read this document, you can see that the author clearly was struggling economically back in China, and somebody who had returned from America and laboring in America, explained the opportunity that existed back in America. And so the economic opportunity, and especially in the context of the economic difficulties in China, is clearly a motivating factor here. But the other question I asked you to consider is who is doing the migrating. And in this case, there's an example of 6 young men who leave China in order to go to America. So that's a really important factor, because one of the realities of migration and massive amounts of migration pattern, we're talking about migration in the thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, from places like China and India into new places. One of the realities is most of the migrants were men. Most of the people who went on these migration journeys were males. And what that meant was that there were demographic changes at societies back home. Oftentimes, those demographic changes meant that there was new responsibilities and roles for women in society. And as men were leaving, women were able to step into those new roles and responsibilities. There's other major effects of migration as well. One of the realities of migration is that when people migrated from one place to another, they often stayed together in their new, what the College Board refers to as receiving societies. These receiving societies, for example, we talked about the United States, or we talked about islands in the Caribbean. In these receiving societies, migrants often created what were called ethnic enclaves. If you're into the TV show Arrested Development, ethnic enclaves are famously parodied in the town of Wee Britain, where a whole lot of British people live in the middle of California. So this picture here demonstrates a common ethnic enclave in Houston, Texas. In Houston, Texas, where obviously Chinese people have taken root and created their own ethnic enclave. You can see in this picture that what we would think of as normal street signs in the United States of America have on top of them added the street signs also in Mandarin Chinese, because most of the people who live in the region spoke Mandarin Chinese. There's lots of examples of ethnic enclaves throughout the world. You can see in this picture the largest example of a Chinese enclave, which is found in San Francisco, California. As a result of gold mining and many Chinese people migrated to the United States and not only stayed in California in order to participate in the gold rush, but traveled in order to help because they were a major source of labor for the Transcontinental Railroad. Other examples of ethnic enclaves included the Chinese people in Peru and Cuba, Indians enclaves in South Africa. Of course, most famously, one of the most famous people who lived in an Indian enclave in South Africa was who we talked about at very beginning of our online lessons when even before we started the review, we were learning back in unit 8 and 9, we learned about a man named Mohandas Gandhi as a part of the decolonization movement. And before he actually began working in the 1900s as a part of the Indian National Congress, he lived in South Africa and worked on behalf of Indians who were discriminated against in South Africa in Indian enclaves. Other examples include Indians in Southeast Asia. In large parts of Southeast Asia, after the end of indentured servitude, they adopted a system called, I'm going to try it, Kangani. The Kangani system actually allowed for the recruitment of entire families, and this helped actually keep the not just ethnic enclaves, but keep more whole and complete Indian customs and traditions and societies. One more famous example of ethnic enclaves was Italians moving into Argentina, where Argentina was famously had a very, very immigrant welcoming policy for its government. One final important effect for us to understand about immigration is that receiving societies weren't always welcoming towards immigrants. As a matter of fact, other than cheap labor, most receiving societies saw little value in immigrants. One of the most famous examples of this is in California. The California Constitution, when it was written, actually stated that Chinese people could not earn citizenship unless they could be proven white. And the United States government eventually passed the Chinese Exclusion Act to limit the number of Chinese people who could immigrate to the United States. Australia was also extremely discriminatory and prejudiced against Chinese immigrants. Famously, Australian miners took up arms and began to actually attack and even publicly execute Chinese immigrants who were working in Australian mines. This led to the Australian government creating the Influx of Chinese Restriction Act, which actually tried to create taxes for Chinese people immigrating into Australia. And eventually, throughout the 1900s, the idea of the White Australia policy, which promoted which promoted white culture and the concept that Australian citizens and Australian workers should be white and not Chinese. All right. I know we went pretty fast today, but even though this is an important unit and for us to understand, there's lots of examples for you to look up and get more information about. So here's some things that you may want to look up and get some more information about. These are examples of voluntary migrant patterns, from where people went to where they went and why they migrated. I don't want to read it to you, so I'm just going to give you about 30 seconds to go over this. A lot of what we already said here, we've discussed already in this lesson. Of course, I'll take a moment to note that I've adapted this chart out of the 2020 AP World History Modern AMSCO book by Perfection Learning. This chart looks very similar, but it's actually extremely different. It's still charting out migration patterns, but this is giving us an example of forced migration, where the migrants had little to no choice in their own movements. So again, I'll give you a few seconds to look over this, and a lot of it is a review of what we already discussed in today's lesson. All right. Finally, let's take one quick review of some of the major effects of immigration. I'll give you about 25 to 30 seconds to try and figure out what you think the 3 bubbles are that would go to this bubble graph. All right, here's what we came up with based off our lesson today. One major effect of immigration took place in home countries where many migrants were leaving to go somewhere else. This was because so many of the migrants were male. As a result, roles and responsibilities for women in these home countries changed. Another example is the development of ethnic enclaves, where similar ethnic people grouped together and created societies of their own, where they celebrated their own cultures, ate their own foods, made their own clothes and products, and oftentimes isolated themselves from other parts of from other communities. However, it also led to diffusion and even fusion of cultures sometime. One famous example is in Peru. Many Peruvian food items involve Chinese food heritage as well. Finally, our last effect of immigration is the prejudice, discrimination, and even state regulations against immigrations in what the College Board refers to as receiving societies, the places where many of these immigrations wound up living as a part of their migrant pattern. All right,